Welcome to the Rock's Back Pages podcast. I'm Barney Hoskins, and I'm on a computer screen with my colleague William Pike.
Hi, Barney.
And joining us from the Dordogne in France to discuss all that's new and cool in the world's largest archive of music journalism is Mr. Brian Cullman. Hello, Brian.
Hello, Barney.
Bonjour, Brian.
Bonjour, ah oui. Encore bonjour. On peut continuer en français.
We could just do the whole episode in French.
S'il vous plaît, non.
But that would require me to be able to speak French. So it's an absolute joy to host one of the best music writers I've ever read on this podcast and to discuss some of the exquisite pieces in his book, How to Prepare for the Past, which is subtitled Travels in Music and Time. Shall we start at the beginning, Brian? Where did you grow up and when did you sell your soul to rock and roll? I mean, assuming you did, like I did.
Yeah, I think I rented it. I'm still trying to collect. So I grew up in New York City. I'm a 10th generation New Yorker, or that's what's claimed. I don't know if that's true, but my father came over in the 1840s. My mother's family came over somewhat before. And I grew up right next to Bloomingdale's.
Wonderful.
Midtown, terrible place to be a kid.
Why? Because it's just so staid and posh.
Well, it was staid and posh, and my friends all lived either on the Upper West Side, where there was a neighborhood, or downtown, where there were neighborhoods. Where I was, growing up in the late 50s and 60s, there were no shops on Park Avenue. Everything closed down after 5 o'clock. It was just nothing but taxis and old women walking their dogs. It was a disgusting place. And so, of course, when I discovered radio, it saved my life. I mean, as Lou Reed says,
yes,
my life was saved by rock and roll. I heard WINS Winds 1010, Murray the K, and that became my temple. It became my church. It was wonderful.
Somewhere I jotted this down. I can't remember where. It must have been in the book. You refer to your home as a house of whispers and hushed words, which implies a little bit that there wasn't a lot of music ringing out at home.
No, we had a stereo television console, and we had 5 albums. We had The Sound of Music, My Fair Lady, Ferrante and Teicher playing Autumn Leaves and other favorites. Someone named George Fair playing Echoes of Paris. And then Patti Page doing Buttons and Bows. No one ever played any records. I tried to find something I could listen to in those and was unsuccessful.
So the radio came to your rescue.
Radio came to my rescue, and I was really naive and stupid. It took until I was about 10 or 11 to realize that what they played on the radio were records. I thought maybe these were people in the studio singing and talking, or that there were tapes. I didn't know that what they were playing was something you could buy.
Wow.
And of course, the moment I discovered that, I wanted to buy everything. And I wanted to hear everything.
There's a great part in your book where you describe the barber, your father's barber, who employed a new hairdresser who ended up turning on the airwaves and didn't show up next week.
He wasn't
because
there.
That was such a transgression in this slightly stuffy barbershop.
Well, it interrupted the silence. And the thing is that people went to the barbershop for this companionable sense of gentlemanly ease. They didn't talk to each other. They would nod to each other, and everything was communicated in those nods.
But with that in mind, was there a sense that the radio was something that by you was perceived maybe as illicit or a little bit naughty to do?
No, I never thought it was illicit, but listening to it was. in that.
A subtle distinction, Brian.
Yeah.
But as a child, I was subtle, and I would turn it on. I was afraid to go to sleep because I was going to miss something. And I remember WBAI, which was a wonderful Pacifica station. I discovered maybe around 1963 or 64, and I'd already heard the Beatles, and the Beatles were the Beatles, that they were an entirely new world, and I inhabited that world. But then WBAI had these DJs, Bob Fass and Steve Post.
Mm.
And I remember one night after midnight, in some weird sequence, they played Lord Buckley, and then Sam Cooke and the Soul Stirrers, and then A Love Supreme, and then Archie Shepp doing Fire Music.
Wow.
And I how could you go to sleep? This was a world that absolutely enchanted me and overwhelmed me. And, in the midst of this, I think they were smart enough to also play the Ronettes. And suddenly, when I heard this, I realized, like, Ronnie Spector and Smokey Robinson and Sam Cooke knew stuff that my parents didn't know and probably didn't want to know. And that's what I wanted.
Yeah, here I is again. That's me. And there's you. And I dig all you cats out there whipping and wailing and jumping up and down and sucking up that fine juice and patting each other on the back and telling each other who the greatest cat in the world is. Mr. Malenkov, Mr. Dallenkov, Mr. Eisenhower.
Similar sort of experiences, but never obviously heard Bob Fass here in London. But the little transistor radio played a similar part. Given your, subsequent writing career, Brian, what was the first music press? What were the first music publications that you ever picked up or read?
Hit Parader.
Right.
Hit Parader was really cheesy. I mean, there weren't any serious music magazines. Hit Parader had very garish red covers, horrible covers where they would have stick figures with the faces of the Beatles or the Stones or Ray Davies put on there. And what was weird about Hit Parader, I discovered much later, was Danny Fields was one of the editors of it. And in the midst of really terrible things. I mean, Connie Francis had a regular column. Connie Francis, your secret sister. There was a reason that was a secret. You didn't want her in the other room. In the midst of this, Danny Fields would get people like Paul Simon or Al Cooper to write about what they were listening to that month. And I remember as a kid, Paul Simon writing about the Voices of Bulgaria, or Al Cooper writing about Dr. John's first album. And, if you read between the lines, you discovered amazing stuff. But you had to actually buy this crappy magazine and you had to read it. And so you would find out much more than you wanted to know about Tommy James and the Shondells, but you'd also find out about the Bulgarian Voices. God bless.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, mention of Danny Fields, who was early on in the lifetime of this podcast a wonderful guest and a wonderful man. That takes us into the next sort of thing I wanted to ask you about, which is really kind of the New York scene in the late 60s, the whole Max's Kansas City scene, because you write beautifully about Lillian Roxon in How to Prepare for the Past. And listen, tell us about Lillian Roxon. Tell us about Max's Kansas City, and Danny Fields, and explain to listeners who may not have ever even heard of Max's Kansas City. Hard to imagine, but just paint us a picture of that moment.
Well, I have to go back a couple of steps. I was obsessed with this music, and there wasn't any way to find out about it. Most of my friends couldn't care less about it. They were obsessed with cars or sports. And I was in a bookstore and I saw a book called The Rock Encyclopedia. And, it was about 600 pages. It was enormous. And it was by this Australian journalist from the Sydney Morning Herald, who was based in New York, Lillian Roxon.
And you knew she was Australian at that point, even before you picked the book up?
It didn't prevent me from buying the book.
No.
No, I bought the book and then I saw, her bio at the back. And I read the book. This was an encyclopedia, but this is the sort of thing you do when, you're a kid. I read cover to cover. I read everything. And she got the energy and she got the feel and she got the passion of the music. Absolutely. But she got the facts all wrong. And when you're 14, 15 years old, I was a train spotter. And I'm reading the book, and she has John Stewart from the Kingston Trio as a member of Buffalo Springfield. And my head started just revolving around. And I started making notes. And I wound up sending her a letter with about 30 pages of corrections. I don't know how I got the balls to do that. Although I realized, I was obsessed with contact. I was writing letters as a 12, 13-year-old to Ray Bradbury, to Kenneth Patchen. They would all write back. This was magic. So I sent this, enormous envelope of corrections to Lillian, care of her publisher. And instead of throwing it away or just going, you asshole, she tracked me down and basically said, how come you know all this stuff? And the reality was, I didn't know. I didn't know how I knew it, but it just clung to me. I was a nerdy kid and I didn't know how to interact with people. So my way of interacting with new people I met was to get them to name a song, and I could tell them who sang it, who wrote it, what label it was on. Terrible stuff. If I met myself, I would hate I would hate it. But
I've heard guests say that before. If I met my nerdy adolescent self, I'd walk a mile.
Instead of just, throwing the letter away, she said, how come you know this? Why don't you work with me? And basically took me under her wing. And it was a massive wing. She knew everybody. Danny Fields was her best friend. My dog wasn't around then, so he has nothing to say about it. She had two roommates in Chelsea, Germaine Greer, who was at that point famous for having written The Female Eunuch, and Linda Eastman, soon to be Linda McCartney. So Lillian moved in this very rarefied and wonderful world. And she wanted me to work on the second edition of the book with her. It never happened. There was no second edition. But she wound up just bringing me along to clubs because, I think she loved having the enthusiasm and the naivete of someone like me who was just starstruck. Now, Max's Kansas City was down around Union Square. I believe it was on 17th Street and Park Avenue South. And it was a sort of dive, cafe, club, restaurant run by this guy, Mickey Ruskin, who loved painters, loved musicians. He let everybody, except me, have a tab.
How old were you at that point?
It was about 15.
Snuck in there by Lillian, 15, right.
Well, I was about 15 and no one carded anybody. If you knew that it was there, you could go. I didn't get to see a lot of the classic shows that people talk about from there. I never saw the Velvets, but I saw Tim Buckley. I saw, I think, the Good Rats.
Janis Joplin?
I saw Janis Joplin there, but not performing. She was just in the back room drinking.
Right.
Everyone was in the back room drinking, and you could only go into the back room if you knew that there was a back room. And once you knew there was a back room, Bob's your uncle. You were welcome everywhere. And I don't remember anyone ever paying for anything. Drinks appeared. You never knew if someone was a waitress or was just, a beautiful transvestite who had stumbled in from the other side of the street. Waitresses would, if they were taking your order, would sit on your lap. I remember there was a waitress in a really high miniskirt with a wonderful ankle bracelet who insisted that I take my shoes off because instead of reading my palms, she wanted to read my feet. It was the sort of place where that wasn't considered inappropriate.
No.
And, Andy Warhol would be there, Janis Joplin, Tim Buckley, Zalyanovsky from The Lovin' Spoonful was always there. And I don't remember, again, I was pretty ignorant and pretty starstruck. So I didn't notice anyone being high. Everyone was just floating. Everyone was very comfortable and very safe.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the word. Everyone felt that they were among people who weren't judging them.
Yes, indeed.
In later years, before Max's closed, I went back and the scene had changed. And by the late 70s, there was a meanness to it. And you'd go into the back room and there was a sense of like, why are you here?
Right.
I remember being in there and Sid Vicious had taken over the jukebox and was very violently playing B-sides of every bad record he could find and singing along to records he didn't know and just looking for a fight. And there was just a sense of trouble in the air.
Yeah. I mean, was it obviously lots of glamorous people were there, but was it a glamorous
No, it was a dump.
place?
It was a dump, and the thing is, it was famous for having bowls of chickpeas on every table, and
not even hummus.
Just basically, you could go there and drink and eat chickpeas, and at some point, someone would buy you a meal, but in the several dozen times that I was there, I don't recall money ever changing hands. It just seemed like, people drank, people ate. There was a back and an upstairs area where there was a stage. It was not a regular club, but there was regular music. I would say, again, my recollection is that it held somewhere between 75 and 3,000 people, depending on who was playing.
I was just a curly-haired mountain boy.
Let's jump to April 1970, Brian. You'd mentioned Hit Parade earlier. And so in the spring of 1970, you knock on the door of the offices of Crawdaddy magazine, clutching a couple of pieces that you'd written for your high school paper. So tell us about that. When did you first read Crawdaddy? And tell us about the two guys who rather sort of snootily inspected your pieces. And then what happened as a result of walking into that office?
Well, Crawdaddy, I discovered probably a year, maybe a year and a half earlier. And it sort of blindsided me because it was the mirror opposite of Hit Parader. It was almost like samizat. It was almost like something that would be Xeroxed in Soviet era and passed from hand to hand. But it was very, very self-serious, and there were like 25, 30-page articles on Brian Wilson or on Donovan, and it was taking every aspect of music, the songs, the production, the styling, the cover, the liner notes. It was taking them all really, really seriously and writing about them from an intellectual standpoint. It was almost like a cahier de cinema, and it was fascinating. And it was started by a guy named Paul Williams, who was sort of a brilliant crank. And I think he was wonderful at promoting himself, but he also had a way of describing how much he loved the music he was listening to in a way that was indelible. I mean, I still remember him writing about Blonde on Blonde. What he wished was that he could actually cut out "I Want You" and send it to everyone he knew. And of course, you can do that now on the internet, but at the time, you had to go over to each other's homes to hear things, or you had to go to a record store where they were kind enough or friendly enough to let you listen to an individual track. Crawdaddy was absolutely sensational and absolutely bonkers in that it treated music as almost museum quality, so that they would write about a new record in the same issue that they would write about, a Jimmy Rogers record from the 1930s or Louis Armstrong. They treated everything as equally important. And it was a real education. And I noticed when Paul Williams stopped writing for them, he didn't just write for them, it was his magazine, but he turned it over to someone named Peter Stafford. In any case, I was going to get a summer job as an intern at a weird documentary company in London called CTV Workshop. And Lillian Roxon kept saying, "You're going to be in London. You should be writing. You should be writing for all sorts of rock magazines. You've got to call Richard Neville." Now, Richard had a magazine called Oz in London. She gave me all these people to get a hold of. But in the midst of that, she said, don't be so lazy. Go talk to some magazines. Well, I was intimidated by Rolling Stone, and they were in California.
Yes.
And Downbeat made no sense to me. I'd outgrown Hit Parader, and I'd never grown into 16 magazine. So Crawdaddy seemed strange enough and sort of marginal enough that they might take me seriously. And I also loved the fact that they didn't have a phone, because I was really bad on the phone, and I thought I'll just go to their offices. And I looked them up, and they were below this really terrible store called Tandycrafts, which sold things no one wanted. No one ever was in there. It was like a Woolworths of cast-offs. They sold baskets and they sold fishing gear, but who buys fishing gear in downtown New York? Anyway, I went down into the basement, and there were two guys, both with really long hair, one with a really floppy mustache, and I don't think they were used to people coming into their place.
Do you remember who those guys were, Brian?
Well, one was Peter Stafford.
Okay.
And the other wasn't Peter Stafford. And they had very dim lighting, and they were both seated behind desks, but there were no other chairs. So there was some luggage, sort of thrown around. So I picked up a suitcase and stood it up and sat on it. And I started just saying I was going to London. And at that point, they realized I wasn't there to bust them. And I, wasn't from any government agency. But they didn't seem like they were going to throw me out. And I showed them these clips that I'd written for a high school paper. One was on John Fahey. The other was on the Paul Butterfield Band. I remember Peter Stafford sort of looking and saying, "Paul Butterfield." And he pronounced the name as if it was a benediction. He sort of said it as if, he was like completing some sort of a magic spell. So I had clearly won them over a little bit with the fact that I had decent taste. And they looked at the articles, and they were probably about 100 words long. I think I'd spent more time tracking down the address of Crawdaddy than I had writing them. They were both really supportive and said, "Oh, it's great. Love to meet you. It's great." We do have a guy in London who helps us out. And their guy in London was Barry Miles.
Yes.
And Barry Miles, who is still with us, was the hippest guy in the room.
Yeah.
He knew everybody. He'd started the Indica Bookshop with Paul McCartney, which is where John had met Yoko. He hung around with everyone that you'd want to hang around with, and he was their London editor. And they sort of said, well, we do sort of have the London scene covered, but
right.
Let us know where you're going to be, and something comes up, we'll call you. So I gave them the number at, CTV Workshop without feeling like anything was ever going to happen. I was pretty deflated and, felt like, okay, this was a really bad idea. And I went over to London, and I went over with a really close friend of mine who hated London. We wound up in this little flat in Islington on College Cross. Wonderful place. Look out the window and there'd be guys with wheelbarrows, like going down the street, sharpening knives for you. It was something very Dickensian.
Wonderful.
It was beautiful. But my friend really didn't like being in the city, and he went up to the Orkney Islands and became a lobster fisherman.
I wasn't expecting
that.
that.
As far from the city as you can get, to be fair.
So, I was sort of derailed. I didn't know what I was going to do. I couldn't afford the place on my own. And the job was a nightmare. I don't know who called in what favor, but they didn't want me. They didn't need me. And they made that very clear. About a week into my being there, the phone rang, and it was Peter Stafford from Crawdaddy. And basically, I did my best not to let them know how unhappy I was. I didn't want, my misery to come through on the phone, because I was really worried that it would. And he just started rambling on about parties and about clubs and musicians. And, had I gone to this concert? I hadn't gone to anything. Had I met this? I hadn't met anybody. Did I know that? I didn't know any of that. He just kept going and going, and finally sort of said, so Barry Miles is coming back to the States. He's going to write a biography of Allen Ginsberg. We need somebody in London. What he didn't say, and what was very clear to me, was they didn't have the money to send anybody over there, and I was it. And he sort of said, do you want to be our London editor? And it wasn't even, do you want to write a couple of stories? It was, do you want to be our London editor?
Right.
Golden ticket. How what an amazing thing. And so suddenly I had a purpose in life.
I'm gonna interrupt you with your permission, just to read from one of the chapters in How to Prepare for the Past, because we're just going to take you straight into, like, this is you now as the London editor of Crawdaddy. I was backstage. I was on the side of the stage. I was on stage singing backup. People I didn't know bought me drinks and gave me their phone numbers. I looked up and I was at the Baghdad House, a restaurant in North London with a private room downstairs where you could smoke hashish and drink rosewater honey. Frank Zappa was there. Peter Sellers was there. Sandy Denny saw me and dragged me off to a recording session doing backup vocals for Stefan Grossman. The backing vocalists were Sandy, Linda Peters, soon to be Linda Thompson, Trevor Lucas, Heather Wood from the Young Tradition, and myself. I was pleased to note that Heather Wood had a tendency to sing flat, same as I did, and we were both conveniently placed behind Trevor Lucas, who was exceedingly loud and reliably in tune. "You're not flat," he told me reassuringly. "You and Heather just like to approach the notes from the south side," which I think is lovely. So,
Great.
I mean, this is the extraordinary thing, and I just I hope it's okay, but I really do want to kind of zero in on these extraordinary, well, particularly three extraordinary people that you got to know, you got to spend time with in London, in North and in fact South London. And that's Sandy Denny, who I've just mentioned, John Martyn and his wife Beverley, and Nick Drake. But if we could start with Sandy, and part of the reason for that is that one of the later kind of retrospective pieces that you've included, that you wrote for the Paris Review and you have included in your book, is called 7.5 Short Notes on Sandy Denny. I mean, for me, she's one of the great British voices. I mean, we're just one of the greatest singers ever in any genre. I don't know if you agree with that, but I'm going to just read one more tiny bit from note 5. And I thought this is such a beautiful kind of perception. Sandy knew she was extraordinary, but she wasn't sure she was any good. Like most great singers, her voice knew far more than she did and kept waiting for her to catch up. The ghosts and spirits she sang about were real and holy and terrifying. And when she sang about Matty Groves, it wasn't an old folk song anymore, but was fresh gossip, dirty news from the street. I just think for anyone who loves Sandy Denny, that is just such a beautiful response to the sound of her voice. Can you just take us back to that moment when she takes you to just when you got to know Sandy Denny and your memories of her?
I was so lucky to be there at that moment. And what I think worked in my favor was, a number of things. Early 70s, being an American was a really good thing. Fast forward, not so much. But, I think that no one had heard of Crawdaddy. So my press credential meant absolutely nothing to the musicians that I cared about. But what they were all dumbstruck by was the fact that I was from New York and I had heard their music and I had heard their records. I had bought their records and I had heard them on the radio. And, Sandy Denny couldn't get over this. I told her I was at a friend's house in Boston and I heard her version of I'll Keep It With Mine with Fairport Convention, and time stopped. I remember very clearly being in this room, this guy, Bobby Reiser, whose brother George studied guitar with Segovia. And they were all very hip to music. And I made everyone shut up because this voice cut through everything. And I went out the next day and bought that Fairport Convention record and listened to it over and over again. She couldn't believe that someone in America, in New York, in Boston, had heard it on the radio, had heard her.
Everybody will help you. Some people are very kind.
This absolutely made her day, her week, her month, because I don't know that, I know that she wasn't aware of how wonderful she was. And she was very uncomfortable with praise. And she was very uncomfortable in any situation where she wasn't either singing or drinking. But, in almost all the cases where I was around her, she was either singing or drinking. And I never saw her drunk. I never saw her sloppy, but I never saw her, outside of a club without a drink in her hand. And, my reason, or the reason that I think she invited me to come to her home a number of times was she couldn't believe that someone from America, from New York, had heard her music and liked it. And so she would play things for me that she was thinking of recording, or things that were, inspiring to her. She had somehow gotten a hold of all of these demos of Bob Dylan songs and, was listening to them, thinking about what she could do. She adored Bob Dylan. She adored Joni Mitchell. When she would put a record on, it's too easy to say, oh, she'd go into a trance. She wouldn't go into a trance, but she would make herself a part of the music. She found a way to, not by singing along, but by somehow, without getting mystical on you, somehow vibrating in the same rhythm or the same energy as the song, until it felt like that song couldn't exist without her.
Mm.
She lived for those moments. She lived for those songs, and those songs lived inside of her.
Good morning, good afternoon, and what have you got to say? Well, I'm waiting, but I can't stay long. It's such a lovely day.
What was your first encounter with John Martyn? Because you talk about his and Beverley's house on just off Hampstead Heath, and how that was in some ways a kind of central locus for this kind of folk rock scene. To I'm not trying to reduce it to that, but just tell us a bit about John, who's another of like my absolute heroes. You reviewed Solid Air, probably his most famous album, for Cream magazine, and it was the first John Martyn album I bought, and I was just obsessed by it. And I saw him perform in London in 1975 when I was only like 16, and I was just a fan for life. And I did get to interview him about 10 years later. I mean, talks about alcohol in connection with Sandy Denny. One can't really avoid subjects of alcohol talking about John Martyn. And you also write about his record collection. Just tell us about John and Beverley, and maybe just how that then was how you got to meet Nick Drake, which not many people can claim to have done.
I was obsessed with all of the artists that Joe Boyd was working with.
Right.
And so early on, I started going over to, he had an office for his company, Witch Season, on Charlotte Street. And he also had the most beautiful receptionist, this woman named Kriana. And I would go over sometimes just so I could look at her. I think other people did that as well, but Joe was almost never there. But, if you went up to that office and hung around for more than half an hour, you'd run into Simon Nicol or Dave Maddox. You'd run into Robin Williamson from the Incredible String Band. And at some point, I mentioned, I had just heard this album Stormbringer that John and Beverley Martyn had made. And Kriana sort of went, John's just back from wherever it was he'd gone. Do you want to go do an interview with him? So I rang him up and went over to his house. And I think we actually did an interview like that first day on Hampstead Heath. I have a tape somewhere or other, which is probably incomprehensible, but Beverley did most of the talking, and was very, very much a part of that. John gets all the attention, but at the time they really were a couple and they really had a partnership. And she was a very active part of their recordings. But, it seemed like they were really interested in what my response was to some of the songs, which songs made sense to me, how I related to them. And over the course of the afternoon, it became clear that the interview was sort of beside the point, and they wanted to get to know me. And again, just as I was talking about with Sandy Denny, they were floored by the idea that I'd heard a song of theirs on the radio, that I'd seen a record of theirs in a record store, that there were people in America who knew their music. And that became my calling card. I was the guy that had heard their records. I'd heard them on the radio. So I would go over to John and Beverley's house on a regular basis, as did a lot of people. They had a good friend who always had great gossip, Paul Wheeler, who was a guitarist and who wrote one of the songs on A Road to Ruin, Give Us a Ring. And his girlfriend was working for John Lennon, I think was a caretaker at Lennon's estate. So he would always come back with with hashish that either had been meant for Lennon and somehow slipped between the cracks, or that John had given them. Always, there was a guy named Andy the Greek who ran the club Les Cousins. And it was just a lovely scene. Now, at the time, John and Beverley were both extraordinarily beautiful, which is hard to navigate when you see pictures of what John turned into, where he, really became a nasty old drunk. And he turned into a nasty drunk very early.
Yeah.
I spent so much time with them, and they were so warm and so kind. And then after not being in Britain for a few years, I went, and John was playing a small club, and I stopped by, and I expected a welcome, and he was very dismissive and very, very sullen. There was an arrogance that hadn't been there before. What I remember from the early days was just the pleasure that he had in playing guitar and listened to a lot of Jeff Moldar. He loved Jeff Moldar, but also listened to Hamza Eldin, listened to a lot of Spanish guitar music. And it didn't seem like there was any sense of vanity. It seemed like he knew that he could play and he knew that he could write, but it didn't feel like he was expecting any adulation or expecting to be treated differently. He was very comfortable just being part of a group of people and being amongst friends, and that changed.
Well, at this moment, Brian, we thought we'd turn our attention to an audio interview with John, which may or may not accord with what you've said, but I'm going to hand over to William at this point, who's just going to tell us a bit about it.
The interview is John Martyn talking to John Hutchinson in 1982. We think it would have been for a piece for Musician magazine, but we're not.
It actually turns out, because John emailed me last night. It was for an Irish newspaper, which is why we couldn't find it in Musician. Yes.
Oh, okay. It was for an Irish newspaper. Correction. It's a good interview. It's a little bit poor audio quality because they're in a room or a restaurant with other people, but you've got the sort of lovely received pronunciation of John Hutchinson speaking to the, I think maybe slightly lubricated and loquacious John Martyn. And they go through everything from his recording techniques to his relationship with the audiences. And it's really interesting what you said about John's record collection, because I think part of the intrigue with John Martyn and his style is the fact that he actually didn't just let guitarists influence him. I think he was just as influenced by jazz and classical music as much as he could be letting Bert Jansch or something be something he was interested in. And he goes into that in this interview, actually. He speaks about Miles Davis or Cannonball Adderley and people like that. And the first clip is John Hutchinson asking about Solidaire and whether it's the sort of crucial album for John. So here we go.
Would it be in Solidaire particularly? Would that be the crucial album as far as...
Probably. I mean, as far as being a traditional music concerned, I would say that was probably the most important.
And would there be any reason for that? Would it just... John's gratuitous?
Time and place.
Yeah.
Definitely.
And what would you pick out as being the most important album you've done? Could you choose one?
Couldn't even begin to. I haven't listened to them at all.
Have you not?
No, I don't bother.
Don't go back.
Just don't bother.
Yeah.
I don't know any more albums.
Do you not?
No. Not one. Not one.
But Solidaire, you'd pick
I
up.
remember it.
Yeah.
Chiefly I remember it because my manager played it to me the other day. Because he wanted me to do 2 songs of it in the live show, and I do.
Yeah.
Living on Solidaire.
He does sound a bit surly. And also, John Hutchinson in his email mentioned that John's girlfriend of the time was there. That's probably her rabbiting away in the background rather inconsiderately, which is annoying. But he doesn't sound terribly happy, does he? He sounds a bit off. He doesn't really... It just sounds... Would you really just say you never even listen to Solid Air or ever listen to any of your old records? Maybe.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting thing for him to say. Yeah, how he doesn't go back and listen to his albums. Maybe that says something about, I don't know, his state of mind during those years, and not wanting to be self-reflecting in a sort of...
This is 1982, and it's coming off. I mean, it's interesting because it's coming off the back of, one of his greatest albums, I think, Grace and Danger. And we're featuring a lovely piece you wrote for musician yourself, Brian, about Grace and Danger. So you'd think, I don't know, that he would be a little bit more, just, I don't know, kind of sort of content with his oeuvre. But Brian, what were you going to comment on John at that period?
I'd like to comment in two directions. One, I think that at that time, a lot of musicians that I ran into, people that, I really admired and really loved, had absolutely no connection with the records they'd made. I was a big fan of Tim Buckley, and I got to spend some time with him.
Did you?
In the mid-'70s. And basically, he was doing a residency at a little club in Boston called Katie's. And I went up the first night he played and went back and started talking to him. And I was knocked out by him playing, but also by just how smart and how charming he was. I was studying Latin American writing at the time, and I don't think he'd finished high school, but he was a total autodidact, and he'd read all of the writers that I was studying, and, not just Garcia Marquez, but Julio Cortázar and Juan Rulfo, and, people that were not in vogue at that moment, but he talked so warmly and so passionately about Miguel Asturias and the book El Tal Malata. And I remember asking him about his album Blue Afternoon, or Blue Melody, and he had no clue what songs were on there. In fact, he did, there's a beautiful song of his called Café that he performed that night. And, I love that song. That was my favorite on that album. And we started talking about it, and he was saying, yeah, I have to record that one. And I had to remind him he already had. He didn't have any of his records.
No, I absolutely get that. I do understand that, but it still feels slightly disingenuous to me that Martyn just disavows this extraordinary back catalogue. Should we hear the second clip?
Yeah, absolutely. The second clip is just John Hutchinson asking John Martyn about him working with Phil Collins on the album Glorious Fool.
What led you to ask Phil Collins to produce Glorious Fool?
He just, we talked about it, and I forgot who mooted the idea. It was either he or me. I think it was, I don't know who mooted the idea. We just agreed it was a good idea. Yeah. This is before he was rich and famous and all that kind of stuff.
Yes. But he played on Grace and Danger, didn't he?
He did, yeah. And I think it was at that point, I think, that we decided that, I don't know who mooted the idea. I honestly can't remember whether it was he or me.
And there was a bit of criticism anyway that his production sort of swamped your style.
Yeah, well, I would
truth in that.
Not for my part. I was glad of myself.
Yeah.
I was glad of myself. So I would not have any. I have no negative criticism whatsoever of Phil's work.
Part of the reason for selecting that clip, obviously, is that Phil Collins has been in the news in the last 2-3 weeks. And we've learned, because he's talked to journalists about it in the last few weeks, that, he followed John Martyn's not very good example by sort of disappearing into a kind of sea of alcohol and nearly died. I wasn't aware that Phil Collins had any sort of alcohol problem back when he would have been producing John Martyn. And that certainly wasn't a sense one had of Phil Collins when he was becoming one of the best-selling artists in the world. But later on in life, I think after the loss of his wife, if I'm correct in saying that, and forgive me if I'm wrong, but that he did start drinking very heavily, Phil. I don't know what's your take on an album like Glorious Fool, kind of relative to earlier records that, you and I both revere, Brian?
It went right past me.
Yeah.
It didn't resonate at all. I didn't have any problem with the production. One of the things that I had a problem with John was I thought he was a wonderful songwriter. I thought that, going back to Stormbringer and then to his first album, to, Head and Heart and Solid Air, of course, and Don't Want to Know About Evil, and Inside Out with Make No Mistake, It's Love. I thought he was a just brilliant, emotional, powerful songwriter, and it felt like either he got very lazy or stopped really thinking about songs as words and music. And I don't know, but one of the only fights I ever had with him was, he was in the States for a tour and we were hanging out backstage and he wanted to know what I thought about Inside Out. And of course, I said I loved it, and he kept pushing me. And finally I said, I like your songs, and I love when you actually sing and aren't simply vocalizing. And he just went, "Oh, you just don't get it. You don't get it. I'm beyond song." And I was like, "No one's beyond song. We carry this around in our head, and the interpretation of it is whatever you want to do." I probably wasn't saying anything quite that clever, but he was really turning away from what I thought were his strengths. I thought that sliding into his vocal style was lazy and sloppy. And I thought every once in a while, he would bring it together into something that was beautiful. And where you could hear the guitar and the voice becoming one, but there was less and less of that.
Time's gone by, calendar leaves and snows fly.
Can we take another leap forward, just in the interest of time? There's so much I would have liked to ask you about, Brian, but I'm going to jump forward to the end of the 70s, when you're writing for Musician and you're living around the corner from Tramps, the club in New York, and you're profiling sort of real heroes of kind of, rhythm and blues and Black American music, James Booker and Johnny Copeland, as well as John Martyn. And you wrote that we have a profile on Rock's Back Pages by you of Richard Thompson. But the thing that really jumped out from your book was this: you got to know the great Big Joe Turner, and there's this magnificent moment where you're having a birthday party and you seat Big Joe next to Quentin Crisp at the dinner table. And I just thought, that's Brian Cullman in a nutshell. I mean, who else would be able to bring those two together and seat them next to each other? Tell us about getting to know Big Joe and his wife.
Well, I lived on 16th Street, around the corner from Tramps. And the guy who ran Tramps, wonderful, big Irishman named Terry Dunn, very clever guy, because he loved, Big Joe Turner, Johnny Copeland, James Booker, Otis Rush, Charles Brown, and he would hire people to do a residency. And Tramps was this wonderful, crazy little bar with a back room, but you could sit at the bar, literally 10 steps away from the stage and not have to pay a cover and just sit at the bar and have a drink and hear any of those guys. What Terry figured out was even a crummy hotel, back in the day, even a crummy hotel was about 60 or 70 bucks a night. But in the building where I lived, you could get an apartment for about $250 a month. So he rented an apartment in that building. And when, Professor Longhair or James Booker would come to town, he'd put them in that apartment. They could do their own cooking. They could make coffee. They could do their laundry. And they could basically stagger over to the club. It was, literally a block and a half away. They weren't going to get lost. They weren't going to be late or too late. It saved him a lot of money. So he installed Big Joe and Joe's wife, Pat, in the building. And Joe filled the elevator. So when he was there, you knew he was there. I had some of his records. So, I brought them down to the lobby, and sure enough, he showed up, and I asked him to sign them. And it was only then that I realized he couldn't actually read or write. I gave him a Sharpie, and he just basically wrote Big K.O. and put an X next to it. And he was so happy that I had these old Atlantic records. And I think he was also really happy that I would hang around with him and I wouldn't ask him about, what the blues was, right. And so it was very companionable. I think he liked having company. I'd run into him in the lobby and we'd go across the street to a little deli called Zookie's, and he'd buy 10 or 12 hot dogs and have that as a snack before dinner. He was, what I found so endearing was, they wound up, they wouldn't leave. They were comfortable in the apartment, and Terry Dunn didn't know what to do. He wasn't going to be the guy who kicks Big Joe out. So they were there for a couple of years, and every Thanksgiving and every Valentine's Day and every Easter, I'd get a little card slipped under my door, and it would be the sort of card you'd give to a 7-year-old, with a demented looking chipmunk on it with, to a fine boy, and they'd put $5 inside it. And,
sweet,
I guess that, I sort of became their kid, and it was very, very sweet. Now, that birthday party that you're talking about, I mentioned earlier, I would write letters to people, but also I loved having a phone book. And on rainy days, I'd look through the phone book, and sure enough, Ornette Coleman is listed in the phone book. John Updike is in the phone book. Isaac Bashevis Singer is in the phone book. Quentin Crisp is in the phone book. So I'm going to have a little birthday party. I call up Quentin Crisp and invite him. And he's like, what time? And he showed up with I want to say a white rose, but I have a feeling it was a white flower that wasn't a rose. And he showed up and was very, very cordial and sat down. I'd like to say he sat on Big Joe's lap, but I think he sat very close to him. And
did they have meaningful conversation, do you think?
I think Quentin explained the meaning of the blues to him, and I think that a lot of his career is based on that.
I mean, for me, Big Joe is one of, rather like Sandy Denny, just one of the great voices. There's a lot of singers who, worked in the idiom that Big Joe Turner worked in, but there's something about Turner's voice that is just, I don't know, it's just more emotionally compelling to me than so many of those little and big singers of the rhythm and blues era.
Well, it's emotionally compelling, but it also has this sort of hint of depravity.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Oh yeah. It's sort of like,
well, Yeah.
when he sings like, I know a girl who lives up on the hill, like basically it's almost like, you want to meet her?
Yeah, you don't need to say any more, do you? It's all implicit. But of course, the famous line about peeping the seafood store, and that very smutty line about shake, rattle, and roll.
Oh.
So yeah, Joe could just insinuate exactly what we all knew he was talking about.
But he could make like the most innocent song sound smutty.
Exactly.
Here comes my baby, flashing a new gold tooth. Well, she's so small she can mumble in a payphone booth. Now flip, flop, and fly.
I just want to ask you an unrelated question, really, because you're also a singer-songwriter, and it always sees the opportunity to ask someone who has operated on both sides of the fence, whether that affects your writing about other artists, that what it's like. You write in the book about performing on stage. I mean, there's a little club in Greenwich Village in the late 60s, the Four Winds, and you sort of nervously and tentatively perform there. You also actually did perform on the same stage as Nick Drake, so you have these experiences. So I'm just wondering whether it kind of helps in a way to be a performer as well as someone who writes about performers.
It helps and it hurts in that I think, the closer you get to the beast, the more you begin to realize that it's really hard to make a record. It's really hard even to make a bad record. It's really hard to write a book, even a bad book. Getting anything actually finished and out into the world comes, as you know, with an enormous cost, and nothing comes out the way you imagine it. I think it's why the French are what they are. They never complete anything because in their imagination, it's going to be so much better than whatever a finished product will be. Mm. And, one of the things that I realized once I started to try to make records and try to be in that world was I was very, very naive and believed that there needed to be a really clear separation between church and state. So, I broke my rule frequently, but I really tried not to write about the sort of music that was close to my heart and the sort of music that I made. And when Musician offered me a column, I asked if I could write about music from outside of the States, if I could write about, it wasn't even called world music at the time. It was still international music. But I really felt, there's something sort of seamy about writing about, Jackson Browne's new record and then trying to pitch a song to him. It's just wrong. And so, I started writing about music from Morocco and from Mongolia and from Africa. I didn't know very much, but I'm a good listener, he says modestly.
I think you are. You clearly are.
But I'm a good enough listener that, I wrote a piece about Mongolian music knowing very little, but just basically putting a couple of records on and turning out the lights and trying to imagine what it was that they were trying to do, what it was that they were doing, how they were finding their way into that particular sound, which was a very particular sound. God bless, about a week after the article came out, Jaco Pastorius called me up and asked if I'd come to Florida and teach him how to be Mongolian.
Wow.
And I was flattered to death, but I sort of went, hey, everything I know is in that article. You want me to come down and read it to you? And he was like, sure. And I was like, no, I'll read it to you on the phone. But I was really flattered that, somehow I had locked into a music that was sort of impenetrable and found some sort of a doorway to allow someone else to hear what I was hearing. Mm-hmm. And that was really important. I don't know that side of things ever helped me in in terms of performing or recording. I think, again, the more you know, the more difficult it is to take the music business seriously as an artist.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
You find as a man gets older, he stops using words like forever.
Brian, I really, really enjoyed the book, and I thought it was really unique in the style that you wrote it. And we've touched on some of your writing, but I thought it was like very different to any other sort of memoirs I've read, and that it's sort of very kind of elliptical, and there's sort of fragments, and while seeming like rhapsodic, it's very, very vivid, the scenes that you paint. And I was just wondering how you approached writing the book in the first place, and also whether you were completely using notes or diary entries or anything like that.
What I find is that I have a really, really good memory for the things that were really important to me. And I have a really bad memory for almost everything else. I was trying to write a story about some travels that I did, where I hitchhiked across the country, before coming to London. And it was only in writing the, third or fourth page that I realized, oh shit, I traveled with my friend Bob. In my mind, I still thought that I was solo, that I was doing all of this on my own. And I realized I had a companion through a lot of that, and I had somehow edged him out. So many of the stories that I write in the book about people like Doc Pomus, about, Big Joe, about Tim Hardin, are edged so clearly that, if I can remember the way the light hit Tim Hardin as he was walking out of a club, or the way Warren Bernhardt sat when he was at the piano, I can recreate the scene, and recreating the scene, I can come right into the conversation, and I know exactly how he sounded. And what I find is, in the same way that I think you can't pray a lie, when you voice something as a prayer, if you don't really want that, you're going to discover it. It's going to come back to bite you. When I would write something down in someone else's voice and it was wrong, I would know instantly.
Was Proust an influence at all on the title of the book?
No, the title was really a gift from the universe. I was in a bookstore, and I saw a book with that title on the top shelf. And I saw that and went, how to prepare for, I need that. And I got a ladder and I climbed up and took it down, and I'd misread it. It was actually how to prepare for the PSAT, which is the public school achievement test.
Oh, beautiful.
But I sort of figured, I'm going to do something with that.
Perfect.
And I did.
Oh, it's been fantastic speaking with you, Brian. We are drawing near to the close of the episode. So I'm just going to mention that when this episode goes live, the featured artist is Martha Reeves. She has a new album out. It's her first album as a solo artist in 22 years, I believe. So featuring 3 pieces about her, including a piece from 1964 about Martha Reeves and the Vandellas, just after the stupendous Dancing in the Street has come out. I don't know whether it had got to number 2 by that point, but that's a great little piece. And then 2 pieces about one when she's just gone solo for the first time in 1972, and another one from Blues and Soul in 1978. Anyway, one of the legendary
I'm flattered to be alongside her.
You will be alongside her, literally. Yes.
Well, how wonderful.
Yes, you and Martha and John Martyn, a holy trinity of musical legends, all on the homepage for a week. At this point, I'm going to ask William just to mention a couple of pieces that he's added to Rock's Back Pages in the last fortnight.
Yeah, 2 pieces, one from back in the day and one a bit more recent. So the first one is Derek Taylor, writing for the Los Angeles Times on the 18th of February, 1968. And it's a slightly bizarre piece where he just lists why he loves LA, and it's called LA, Where It's At. And he says, it's where the grass is greenest. It's where you can be a genius in February and a flop in March, forgiven in April, forgotten in May, embraced in June, reinstated in July, and number one in August. And it rarely rains. It's where the LA Free Press and the Open City are. It's where the canyons are. It's where you can hear rock and roll in the open air by night across the hills and where the neighbors don't complain. It's Tape City, Drum City, Music City. It's Trip City. It's mostly one-story buildings. It's crosswalks. Hugh Masekela came here. He'd been to New York and he came from South Africa, but he's here now.
Let me tell you, for Derek Taylor, that's not bizarre. That's just essence of Derek. Did you ever meet Derek, Brian?
Never, but I hope to. Well, maybe not.
Well, in the afterlife.
Yes.
Yeah. I did know Derek Little, and he was just one of the great characters and just heroes, really, for me, of popular music. Anyway, back to you, William.
No, cool guy. I did slightly wonder reading this piece whether he was being sarcastic or not, but given he was writing for the LA Times,
always a bit of a tongue in cheek for sure.
Yeah,
but he had adopted Los Angeles himself, having been the Beatles press officer. He went to LA to live the LA dream, and he did for a number of years.
Yeah, good for him. All right. Well, the second piece is Paul Denoyer, who's getting a lot of airtime at the moment because he's a new writer and just brilliant. So he's writing for The Word in April 2004, and he's interviewing Amy Winehouse, where he says, Amy Winehouse, is she hip-hop's Jane Austen? It is a truth universally...
I thought that might amuse Brian.
So he says, it is a truth universally acknowledged that chart-busting debut albums these days are made by 20-year-olds with a stage school in their past and a disturbingly serious attitude to life and career. Paul Denoyer suggests Amy Winehouse might lighten up a bit. He asks Amy, you must have had experienced people around you. Are you a good collaborator? Amy says, no, because I know what I want to do before the other person is even in the room. Making the album, I was very focused. At that point, I was like, look, here is my music. We need brass on this, or that needs to be faster. I don't want strings. If you want to work with me and you love strings, then go home. I probably earned a reputation as a difficult person because I wrote my own songs and I didn't need people in the studio with me. Not to be rude, but these people would be trying to write pop songs. And I would say, who are you writing for? What session are you on? Get out. But then I'd waste a day trying to be nice to the person. I'd waste studio time letting them do what they wanted because I thought it would be the polite thing to do. And then Paul describes her. The steely resolve is obvious. She picks up her fork and impales a meatball. You learn as you go along, she says. I thought that was great because, she so is an artist, Amy Winehouse, that just like knew what she was doing in the studio. Her vision was always complete, I really think. Whether she was working with Mark Ronson or whatever, she knew the sound that she wanted. And that's how she got such a distinct style of music. And she puts it there so brilliant.
Well, just like Jane Austen, she inhaled and impaled meatballs just perfectly.
Just like Jane Austen did. I'm so glad you
that's
pointed
where the
that
title
out.
comes from, for sure. Yeah.
It's rigged up in my head, it's shoved under my bed, and I question myself again. What is it about me?
I have a couple of things in Jasper's absence. One that harks back to the Derek Taylor era, 60s. It's from 1975. It is about John Phillips. John Phillips, by this time in New York, putting on a musical called Man on the Moon on Broadway. Paul Morrissey of Warhol fame, you will remember him, Brian, had some involvement with. And so Paul Morrissey says to Ed McCormack in The Village Voice, January 75, and I dedicate this quote to Chris Campion, by the way, former podcast guest, who's been finishing a John Phillips biography for about 15 years now. So this is for you, Chris. Paul Morrissey. I don't care for John's early stuff that much. I despise that noisy trash the kids go to the Academy of Music to freak out to. What do they call it? Heavy metal trash or something like that? Now, I do like Roberta Flack and the Supremes. Motown reference. But you wouldn't call that rock, would you? The music John has written for this show, Man on the Moon, has actual melodies. This is a really sophisticated score that has nothing to do with rock and roll. You must remember, John Phillips has grown up. He's a civilized adult, a mature human being, a father of 4 kids. He isn't some drug, trash, rock and roll hippie anymore. Well, Chris, I think your book will probably take issue with that quote. Because I think John Phillips was probably one of the most sort of drug, trash, rock and roll hippies of all time, as his own book makes clear. Anyway, John Phillips, Mamas and Papas fame, etc. The piece is called John Phillips on the Great White Way. I don't think the musical lasted very long. The second piece is really just to mark the recruitment of the great Barry Walters to Rock's Back Pages. We had him on the podcast the other day talking about his fantastic book, Mighty Real. And this is a piece that came out in 2017. Its title is Madonna's Erotica, Sex. So the album Erotica, the book Sex. Why musical masterpiece, defiant books still matter. And this is Barry. We finally hit a tipping point when popular culture is offering more viewpoints and voices. That's why there's a rise in fascism to suppress them. Sex and erotica's greatest contribution remains their embrace of the other, which in this case means queerness, blackness, third-wave feminism, exhibitionism, and kink. Madonna took what was marginalized at the worst of the AIDS epidemic, placed it in an emancipated context, and shoved it into the mainstream for all to see and hear. And I plucked that out for obvious reasons, really, Brian, the world we're in, the America that we're living alongside now. This is 2017, so, we're already a year into Trump's reign in the first term. And so Barry uses the word fascism here. And I think what we are seeing, I don't know if you agree, Brian, is, a very, it's fascistic, it's evangelical. There is an absolute horror of anything that isn't sort of heteronormative and white and nationalistic, and who knows where it's all going. How are you feeling about the climate of, for example, the arts and liberal education, etc., in the United States?
I'm terrified. I'm look, I've got a kid. He went to school in the UK. He went to St. Andrews and Cambridge. Okay. And he's now living in Edinburgh. I'll see him in a couple of days. He doesn't want to go back he'll come back to New York to visit. And at the moment, I'm living there, but New York is a bubble. New York is a wonderful bubble, and it's filled with people who aren't afraid of other people. People talk to each other on the street. We have a wonderful mayor who happens to be Muslim and happens to be doing great things for the city. And I worry whenever I think about him that, one of the goons that is in charge might find a way to bump him off.
It's interesting. London is a bit of a bubble, really, too. It's a huge bubble, but it's sort of symptomatic of the same thing. And I would say that, who am I to speak for all Londoners? But I would just say that most Londoners are really happy to get along with each other. There is a real sense of community here. It is multicultural, it's multi-ethnic. And most of us really love that. But outside of London, it's perceived as all kinds of things. Somehow that becomes elitist, that you tolerate people who are different from you. That becomes evidence of metropolitan elitism. And I'm not as terrified. I don't think. We have a Labour government in power, but obviously we have the likes of Nigel Farage and Tommy Robinson at large. And so am I as terrified as you must be? Probably not. But I never rule out where all this stuff could go, this unholy trinity of nationalism, racism, and religious fundamentalism. And obviously America is trying to interfere in our politics here, which I profoundly resent. Elon Musk funding far-right think tanks and so forth, and stirring up shit about, ethnic minorities here. It's grotesque.
Getting on screens at Tommy Robinson's marches.
Yeah. It's so this isn't, you can't separate these things out anymore. They want to create a kind of global racist imperialism, I think. Anyway, so Barry Walters was pointing all this stuff out nearly 10 years ago. He's a wonderful writer, fantastic. We're
Great
adding
writer.
pieces by him, and his book is a cry of resistance against all this reactionary shit. Frankly, anyway, we'll probably have to cut all that out because I'll just get in trouble.
Nah. I mean, you might as well just review Elon's last record because no one bought it.
Thanks again so much for joining us. That brings us to the end of episode 233 of the Rock's Back Pages podcast. Many thanks to our guest, Brian Cullman, for talking to us about his wonderful book, How to Prepare for the Past. Do go out and buy it, and do check out Brian's writing on Rock's Back Pages. Please also follow our podcast on whichever platforms you use, and why not subscribe to Rock's Back Pages itself. We'll be back in a fortnight with the excellent Mitchell Cohen, and a native, fellow New Yorker of yours, to talk about his new book, Wake Me, Shake Me. So it's farewell from us and from our guest, and all together now, goodbye.
That concludes episode 233 of the Rock's Back Pages podcast. Many thanks to special guest Brian Cullman. How to Prepare for the Past, Travels in Music and Time is published by Z Books and available now from all good bookshops. Those to Barney Hoskins and William Pike, and the producer was Jasper Murison Bowie. The Rock's Back Pages podcast is part of the Pantheon Podcast Network. You can find thousands of articles, as well as hundreds of full-length audio interviews at rocksbackpages.com.